Welcome to Navigating India. While the popular narrative about India's freedom struggle is that it is largely non-violent, there are also few individuals who took to revolutionary methods to liberate India from the colonial rule. People like Bhagat Singh, Chandrashekhar Azad, Prasad Bismil, Ashfaqulla Khan, Sukhdev, Rajguru, etc. While these individuals acted within the Indian borders, there are also individuals who went abroad, tried to forge allies, trying to send weapons to India, trying to get funding for Indian revolutionaries, assassinating British officials in London, forming organizations, parties, and committees, and also having complicated love lives. Two such extraordinary individuals are Virendranath Chattopadhyay, alias Chatto, and M.N. Roy. In her book Spies, Lies, and Allies, Kavitha Rao traces the trajectory of these two extraordinary individuals. Kavitha Rao, thank you so much for coming to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
Thank you, ma'am. I want to start with this first question. Why have you chosen these two characters, Virendranath Chattopadhyay and M.N. Roy?
It's a long answer because there were many reasons. To begin with, I started out being really fascinated by the character of Virendranath Chattopadhyay, who, for those listeners who don't know, was Sarojini Naidu's brother. Okay, and he took a completely different path from Sarojini. Sarojini Naidu was a Gandhian, believed in ahimsa, non-violent path, was a part of the Congress, and we know about her. But Virendranath Chattopadhyay, right from a fairly early stage, was a revolutionary. In Was an anarchist, believed in complete revolution against the British, was not interested in compromises, and he was pursued all across Europe by the British Secret Service and moved all around Europe to Paris, London, Paris, Berlin, Sweden, and eventually he ended up in Soviet Russia, where he was executed by Joseph Stalin in Stalin's Great Purge. Again, something that's not known to most people because his entire history was sort of erased and he was forgotten. So I was fascinated by this man. And then later, I became fascinated by a counterpart of his and a rival, really, though they did not meet until later in their lives, M.N. Roy, who is better known, but led an equally exciting life. I mean, both their lives were so exciting that I have been saying I could not write about them. Because again, he too was pursued by the British Secret Service. He got involved, he became Lenin's protege, Lenin's young man. He was involved in smuggling the Russian crown jewels. He was pursued, all across the world. He went to the US, he went to Mexico. He eventually also ended up, in Berlin and in Soviet Russia, and finally returned to India, where he was sort of marginalized by the Gandhi and the Congress. So I felt like both these men had really exciting and interesting lives that deserve to be better known. And I should tell readers that my previous book was Lady Doctors, which was a book about India's first women doctors from the 1860s to the 1930s. And that did very well. It was a bestseller, even though I sound very immodest. And because of that, I got lots of offers to write again about the first women, constitution makers, the first women engineers, the first women high court judges. And I just didn't want to be stuck in that box where I just was a woman writer constantly writing about women. I wanted to write about men as well. Uh, and it has happened, I think, that men seem to be mostly reading this book, which is the pity. I would like everyone to read it. But that's a very long answer to your question. But, that was how it started.
No, I have one more question to ask. So there are a whole host of characters in your book who are, apart from Roy and Chatto, who are living abroad and trying to create revolution against the British Empire. Why were the stories forgotten for a very long time? Like, for example, when it comes to India, we have movies on Bhagat Singh, and thanks to Rang De Basanti, we have the whole host of revolutionary characters coming in. But these extraordinary lives are forgotten for a very long time. What is the main reason?
So there were many reasons again. So again, a very long answer. So Chatto, as I said, was executed by Joseph Stalin in Stalin's Great Purge in 1937. But nobody knew about this. I mean, even his close associates and family did not know about this because Stalin's misdeeds were covered up for so many years. It was only in the 1950s and 60s that even, Russians came to know about this. He managed to massacre, thousands of people without anybody ever knowing about it. So Chatto sort of completely disappeared. People thought that he had died perhaps of illness or, something like that. They didn't know that he was executed. So he was sort of completely forgotten about. And another reason was that Chatto, of course, did not severely criticize Gandhi, Nehru, and the Congress at the time. He had, major differences with them. So they didn't really care too much about him. Emin Roy had the same issue because he was an extremely undiplomatic man. He was a little more diplomatic than Chatto, and when he returned to India, he tried to work with Gandhi, Nehru, and the Congress, but he just couldn't make those compromises. We'll talk more about that later. And so, therefore, he too was sidelined. And I would say that Emin Roy has been completely erased because in West Bengal, he's a very well known man. He has appeared on postage stamps and even in other parts of India, communist India, because he was one of the early co founders of the Indian Communist Party. But I still think that, he's not a household name. If you asked to say a person in Bangalore, I mean, they wouldn't know about him. They would certainly have heard of Subhash Chandra Bose and Bhagat Singh. And the second reason is that Chatto and Roy, all their uh, achievements were abroad. And there was very tight censorship by the British. They confiscated a lot of their writings, their letters, and so forth. So, the British found a way to kind of, Secret Service found a way to kind of sort of, erase everything that they had done. Uh, and thirdly, I think this is also a reason both Chatto and Roy were communists at certain points. Roy later left the Communist Party and founded his own philosophy, and he became a lapsed communist. And communism these days is, of course, very unfashionable because many people have realized that it doesn't quite work as it should. So this is a lot of people have told even me, I don't want to read about communists. And I just want to say to any readers, when I started out to write this book, I didn't want to write about just the communist philosophy. It's not a book about communism versus capitalism versus socialism or anything else. It is a popular history about two people who were human before they were anything else. They tried, they failed, they tried again, they failed again. They had terrible toxic relationships and they made huge messes of their lives. So it's a book about humans and what it is to be human, or at least that's what I've tried to do. So
Yeah, that is interesting because especially about M. Roy, at least we get in our curriculum, whoever is doing political science for undergraduate,
yes.
while we don't know the details of his life, right? But
Yeah.
he formed communist parties of two countries, India as
Correct.
well as
Yes.
Mexico. And your book is interesting because rather than entering into deeply into their personal writings and trying to is look at their ideology, you have given a trajectory of their lives, and that's what I
Yes.
want to talk about. First, let's talk about the childhood and the early education of these two individuals. Let's start with Chatto. Tell us about Chatto.
So Chatto, Virendranath Chattopadhyay, as I said, he was a brother of Sarojini Naidu. And he was the son of Agornath Chattopadhyay. And the entire family, Chattopadhyay family, was a very highly educated, intellectual, secular family. They grew up in Hyderabad in what is called the Golden Threshold, which still survives. In fact, one of my book readings for my book tour was in the Golden Threshold. It's now part of Hyderabad University. So a very secular, very highly educated, very highly accomplished family. Uh, Chatto had they were, seven siblings. And apart from Sarojini, another very famous sibling was Harindranath Chattopadhyay, who became a famous poet, actor, writer, general Renaissance man. Another sister was Suhasini, who married A.C.N. Nambiar. the marriage didn't work out. Okay, who was also a revolutionary and a spy, some people say. So, very accomplished and intellectual family. He grew up, he had a lot of privilege at that stage in his life. They actually sent him to the UK to study, hopefully to be a lawyer. And of course, he took a different path. So, very highly educated, very secular. Agurnath Chattopadhyay was a very interesting man who also spoke up against the British, and was involved in early nationalist movements and involved in, uh, different thinking, different thoughts. He had, hosted addas in which he would host lots of people from all different sections of the society. So Chatto was exposed to dissent and thinking differently and nationalism at quite an early age, but it was a genteel, non-revolutionary sort of nationalism. Uh, and that's the path that Sarojini took later. Emin Roy had a completely different upbringing. He did not come from a rich family. His father was a school teacher. He grew up in a very small village in West Bengal, Arbelia. And right from the beginning, he was involved in revolutionary activities because this was the Bengal of, Vivekananda, Aurobindo Ghosh, Bipin Chandrapal. So he was very influenced by these young Bengal radicals, and especially so by a man called Jatindranath Mukherjee or Baga Jatin. He was called that because he killed a tiger with nearly his bare hands. So, and who believed in, radical nationalism. And Baga Jatin was also part of the Anushilin Samati, which was a sort of very robust nationalism, which involved, some amount of religion, Hindu scriptures, as well as, very radical nationalism at a time when people like Gandhi and Nehru and others were still very moderate and were still, talking about dominion status for India. So in fact, the chapter in Emin Roy is called the bomb thrower. He called himself a bomb thrower because right from a very early age, he was throwing bombs at British officials and doing extremely radical things, gathering money, gathering arms. And eventually he was sent by Baga Jatin to Southeast Asia to gather more money and arms for India. So it was a completely different upbringing. But eventually they both ended up having similar goals. So that was their childhood.
So they came in contact with these revolutionaries. In case of MN Roy, it is Baga Jatin in Bengal. In case of
Yes,
Virendranath Chattopadhyay, so little bit later when he was in London in India House. So there are
yes.
revolutionary organizations both in India and abroad. Can you throw some light on the origins and what are the forces that led to creation of this revolutionary stream?
So Chatto came to the UK to study to England. And initially, he just wanted to study, and he ended up coming in contact with people who lived in a place called India House, as you mentioned. Let me clarify that this India House is a sort of house in hostel in Highgate. It's not the India House that also exists today, which is the Indian consulate in Holborn. Two different places because people have asked me that. Anyway, this was like a sort of hostel for young Indian men who wanted to study in the UK run by a man called Krishna Varma. But Krishna Varma actually had very radical nationalist views. He was one of the early radicals. And he started encouraging people who believed in complete freedom from India and who believed in attaining that freedom by revolutionary means. He started inviting people like that. And one of the early people to come was V.D. Savarkar. Uh, and at this time, Chatto and Savarkar were very good friends. Savarkar was preaching complete revolution, and he was preaching, and initially Chatto did not, believe in violent revolution. But slowly, and he had many differences with Krishna Varma, but slowly, and he came over to the other side. He was influenced by Savarkar, Madanlal Dhingra, Madam Kama, all these people, VVS Iyer, all of these people who were at India House and were giving, fiery speeches at that time. And so, this is how he eventually was influenced. And as soon as he could, he fled to Paris because the British police was trying to arrest him in the UK. And from then on, he became ever more radical once he was, out of the hands of the British police. So this is how I think he was influenced by all these people.
Can you throw us more light on the anti-colonial movement that is happening in foreign land? Why did these people choose to go and fight there, especially London, right? They are trying to dethrone the Emperor of UK, and they are in that very land doing that. Why did they choose the foreign land and not their own country?
Yeah, so as I say in the book, one reason was because the UK, while it was not completely free, had still had more freedom of speech, and it was more liberal than in India. In India, the British could do anything because, it was a colonial subject. In Britain, they had to follow certain rules at least. For instance, Krishna Varma, Chatto, many others were able to write letters in the Times pleading for the revolution of India. Sorry, pleading for independence of India. And this they could not have done easily in India. Okay. They would have been, arrested for sedition or whatever. So this they could do in the UK a little easier, and I think that's why so many people came. Of course, this happy state of affairs didn't last long because then, when certain events happened, when Curzon Wiley was assassinated by Madanlal Dhingra, soon the police came to get Chatto and Savarkar. Savarkar was arrested. So this happy state of events didn't last long, but as long as it lasted, so basically the life of revolutionaries like Chatto and many others was to be constantly on the run. So they would flee from one country to another depending on where the police were after them. And I hope I've brought that out in the book. It was not a glamorous life, though it seems like it. It was actually a life lived in fear, lived in complete penury and poverty with no ties, a very lonely life. And yeah, let me add that that is another reason why I was so fascinated by these two men, because I have led a very, very mobile life myself for various reasons. So, uh, you know, I kind of identify with this feeling of not ever having a home and being sort of neither here nor there always. This is a thing that happens when you travel a lot. There are upsides also, but this is what happens. So, anyways, so that's the reason.
So while you spoke about loneliness, one thing I want to ask is about their families, right? Sarojini Naidu has once publicly disowned her association with
Yes.
Virendranath Chattopadhyay, and I haven't seen M.N. Roy interacting with his family after he left the country for a very long time. How was their relationship? How did this have psychologically affected them?
So Chatto and Sarojini, they did not get along, especially towards the latter half of their lives, because, yes, Sarojini denounced Chatto for following the revolutionary path, and in turn, she was shouted at by Agornath, who believed that you have to have loyalty to your family always. Because Sarojini by then was a Gandhian, she was a very close friend of Gandhi. And Chatto called Sarojini, in response, Chatto called Sarojini a puppet in the hands of Gandhi and Nehru. He was very clear that he did not believe that Sarojini had any power in the Congress. She was just a figurehead, first woman, Nightingale of India, that kind of thing. And Chatto and Sarojini did not get along. Chatto seems to have been close to Harindranath and Suhasini because Harindranath visited him in Berlin and writes quite a lot about him, even though Harindranath was born after Chatto left. There's a huge, age difference between them. So in that sense, he didn't have much time with Harindranath, but when they met in Berlin, Harindranath wrote very movingly of how Chatto by this time was tired of being in exile. But he couldn't return to India because he knew that he would be immediately arrested by the British and jailed. Because by then he was, he had many sort of, strikes against him. And he asked Harindranath, if I come back to India, won't my people hide me? And Harindranath very sadly says, no, I don't think you can come back to India. I don't think you can remain hidden. The British will catch you. And the last glimpse they have of each other is Chatto standing very lonely on the platform in Berlin and Harendranath leaving. And Suhasini also came to Berlin. Her marriage with Asia Nambia broke up and she returned to India. And they also had some interactions. I think Suhasini and Chatto had a better relationship because Suhasini was a communist. Okay. Uh, so Chatto had some relationships. And then, of course, we can talk about his romantic relationships, which is a whole book in itself a little later. But Emin Roy, from what I could find, doesn't didn't seem to have close relationships with his family at all. Both his father and his mother died when he was quite young. And he had a brother, but he doesn't seem to have had much, interaction with him. I mean, Roy, deserves an entire book in himself, really. And there have been, scholarly studies on him, but not much popular history because he was such a charismatic man. I think he made friends and acquaintances wherever he went. If you read his writings, he was a very confident man. And yeah, we'll come to that again. He also had two wives who seem to have provided him the companionship that he needed and lots of other affairs as well. So, but in their own family, they don't seem to have had, you know, much, many relationships. Their relationships were with other revolutionaries, other people, friends, peers, Berlin revolutionaries, communist revolutionaries, that kind of thing.
No, here because we are exploring about the revolutionaries abroad, one person I want to talk about is the Savarkar. Out of the many snippets in your book that you have said, Savarkar's escape was one of my attempt to escape was one of my favorites. Could you tell us
Mhm.
about that incident, his arrest, and the story of it?
Yeah, my Savarkar chapter is very controversial, and in my book readings, a lot of people had issues with it because a lot of people think of Savarkar as he was later when he was, um, completely pro-Hindutva and extremely bigoted and right-wing. At the time that this Chatto met Savarkar, he wasn't, as far as I could see, any of those things. He was a radical revolutionary, but he was not into Hindutva, he was not into bigotry. In fact, there were other characters who were more bigoted than him. And Chatto, to the end of his life, was extremely secular and extremely irreligious. He didn't believe in religion at all. In fact, he went out of his way to offend religious people of all stripes. Okay. And Savarkar was arrested. And the account I have is of Harendranath Chattopadhyay, who I must say is a bit of a exaggerator in some ways. He writes in a very flowery style. And his account was that Savarkar, when he was arrested, he was being taken, in a ship. And he basically asked to go to the toilet. And he stripped off all his clothes, oiled himself with oil, and managed to escape through the porthole and swam to the nearest shore, which was France. Okay. And he managed to kind of come ashore and try to ask for help. But because he didn't speak much French, he wasn't very successful and he was sort of swiftly reapprehended and taken off to trial. And of course, eventually ended up in cellular jail in the Andamans. So Harendranath Chattopadhyay writes this in a very dramatic fashion, but I wonder if it happened that dramatically. There is a certain bit of embellishment by possibly Savarkar's followers who have kind of made it out to be a very dramatic escape. Uh, in those days, there were a lot of dramatic escapes. Chatto himself had a very dramatic escape, which appears in the Somerset Maugham story, Julia Lazari, where he was, portrayed as a spy, Chandra Lal, and this actually happened. I mean, I'll just talk about that. Harindranath Chattopadhyay talks about that as well. And even that he talks about in a very dramatic way. I wonder whether it really happened that dramatically. It's hard to tell. But Chatto was actually told, somebody called him and said he was living in, I think, Germany at the time, and he was asked to come to Switzerland in order to get some arms and money. And he immediately rushed off quite foolishly. as even Harendranath acknowledges. But actually, it was a ploy by the British Secret Service. And in fact, that chapter of the book is called a dagger, a revolver, and a bottle of chloroform. Because, I mean, literally, he had such an exciting life. You never hear about this with Gandhi or Nehru and anybody. When he got there, he found he was grabbed by two British Secret Service agents who put him in the boot of a car, and they had uh, a dagger, a revolver, and a bottle of chloroform, and they had been told to execute him because by then he was a real thorn in the side of the British Empire. Kill him rather, not execute. Luckily for Chatto, because he was in Switzerland, the Swiss police noticed that this car, seemed full of a struggling man or something was going on. They caught him, and because Switzerland was neutral, they let him go, and he was rescued. And this Somerset Maugham wrote about Chatto in his story called Julia Lazari, and he cast Chatto as this sort of very dangerous revolutionary called Chandralal. It's a very Orientalist story, and in that story, the spy Chandralal eventually kills himself with poison, commits suicide by taking poison. So, it's very dramatic, and a lot of people had very dramatic escapes, including Emin Roy as well. He also had many dramatic escapes from the British in Asia, you know. So that's Savarkar's story. Uh,
No, that is fascinating because we only know him as this Hindutva figure, but early on he was completely different, right? And
He was completely different. I think this is also borne out by other books on Savarkar because this was quite early on. This was like in, 1905, 1910, it was, life was, people were quite different then. And later he changed his mind and he became a completely different person. I'm pretty sure that Chatto would not have been friends with Savarkar or vice versa if they had known each other in later life because Chatto was so secular, so irreligious. He mixed with peoples of all communities, all languages. He ate beef, in front of Hindus because, he wanted to kind of show them that you can eat anything, He did not believe in religion at all. And for that matter, neither did M. Roy. Both of them were extremely religious.
no, even with Emin Roy, I think one story about Emin Roy I like is when he goes to meet a German ambassador in German embassy in China,
Yeah.
Scott, and he says he's just a student, and he somehow escapes from them. He was left free. These extraordinary stories about these people trying to evade the police and the secret service of many countries. Now, I'm wondering about this one story because we talked about M.N. Roy. When M.N. Roy meeting German ambassador, that episode is significant for some reasons. Could you tell us a little bit about that story?
Yes. So, around the time, around 1912 or just before the First World War, uh, Germany was obviously, fighting against Britain. And therefore, Emin Roy and, many Indian nationalists, many Indian revolutionaries felt that India's natural ally was Germany. And therefore, Emin Roy met the German ambassador to ask for arms and money for India. And the discussions proceeded for quite some time, but then eventually the German ambassador was reluctant to provide arms and money. And this was a constant theme for both Chatto, Emin Roy, and every other revolutionary working in that area. Uh, Germany and other countries would go so far, but no further. They would try to, they would have some alliances with Indian revolutionaries, but they would never commit completely. And the reason being, as the German ambassador said, do you really believe that India can ever be independent and govern itself? And there was a sort of, closet racism, or maybe not even so closeted, where they believed that brown people cannot govern themselves. And this racism was shared even by, supposedly advanced people like, Dutch socialists, German socialists, Russian socialists, and, British socialists. Nobody ever believed until Gandhi that India could govern itself and win independence. And therefore, they did not think of, they thought that these Indian revolutionaries were just very, minor players in a big canvas. And therefore, they M.N. Roy and Chatto were never successful in getting enough money and arms from Germany or Russia or any other country.
No, this is fascinating because despite the existence of this subtle racism, there were a stream of Indian freedom fighters who were actually thinking in terms of um, anti-imperialism globally, right, for the freedom of the whole world. And one such an individual who genuinely fascinates me is the Virendranath Chattopadhyay's wife, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, who later divorced. And this snippet of she meeting Eleanor Roosevelt in United States and talking about the liberation and talking about black rights. And this is a very fascinating story. Now, here is where I want to ask you further is despite having this a kind of a transnational understanding, why did we not able to forge a strong global anti-colonial movement for a very long time?
Yeah, it's a complicated question. I'm glad you mentioned Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay. She's such an interesting woman. I would have liked to have more of her in my book, but the thing is that so many books have been written about her. And, I think Nico Slater has done
Yeah.
as good a job as anybody else. So there wasn't much to add, and I didn't want it to take away from the main book. But any readers who are listening, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, immensely fascinating, incredible woman. Uh, why didn't India forge a anti-colonial? I think they were our efforts were too scattered. There was a lot of dissension amongst the Indian revolutionaries. For instance, Chatto and Roy were arch rivals and did not get along at all. And, there was so much dissension about the right path to take and, who they should ally with, who they shouldn't ally with. And, for instance, I think Bose was the most successful in a way, but then he had to ally with the Japanese, which M.N. Roy, for instance, Bose apparently invited him to join the INA. And M.N. Roy flatly refused because he believed that's in the book. There is a small paragraph about that. Because M.N. Roy flatly refused to join because he believed that the Japanese were worse imperialists than the British. Plus, by that time, this was the Second World War. He believed that the main thing should be to get out Hitler. He believed that Nazism was the worst thing ever, and therefore he did not want to ally with the Japanese and the Nazis. So he refused. So people, all the alliances that they could make were difficult. For instance, Emmett Roy was Lenin's young man, and he believed quite strongly in communism around that time in the 1920s. But then he saw that the excesses of the Bolsheviks, and he saw that communism was not working as he thought it would. And he was expelled from the Comintern party by the time Joseph Stalin came in. And so, the allies that they made weren't right. And their efforts were very scattered. And I have been asked this question. I have been asked uh, if M.N. Roy and Chatto had been able to get money and able to get arms and been able to convince other powers to do this, would India have got freedom earlier? And it's a very difficult question to answer. Who knows? I mean, who has can look back into the past and who has a crystal ball? But I do not think so. I think it was only Gandhi who had the charisma and the wiliness and being a completely savvy political operator. Only he had the vision to unite the whole of India. Okay. uh, Only he had the vision to unite the whole of India under the non-violent banner, which also got support from across the world, because the world was very happy to support a non-violent movement. And this is why Gandhi's methods have been copied so much by Martin Luther King, by Nelson Mandela to an extent. This is exactly why it worked, because it united the whole of India. Not everybody can be a revolutionary and travel across the world, giving up their families, escaping from the British Secret Service. But even, you know, even a 10-year-old boy or a housewife can give up British goods, can take to khadi, can walk on the streets protesting in a non-violent way. And this was Gandhi's genius, okay, which and he was also in tune with the spirit of India. And Nehru too, though not as much as Gandhi. For the sake of Congress unity, he would go along with Gandhi. And he too was in tune with the spirit of India in 1947, a very different country from what it was now. And Roy and Chatto were not, because they had been abroad for so long. I hesitate to call them elitist exactly, but in a way they were. They were not elitist, but they were out of touch with the realities in India. And Roy realized this, which is why he joined the Congress when he returned to India. He realized that. In the end, he couldn't make the compromises required, but I feel like he realized that this was, situation. So yeah, it's a complicated question.
Now, I want to make one observation. I recently read the English translation of Ram Prasad Bismil's autobiography, A Glimpse of Life, and he wrote that few days before he is going to be executed in the jail, smuggled it out and published it in Hindi. Now it's translated, and in the final chapter, he writes that it is better for youth of India to join the Congress party because he personally feels India is not ready for a revolutionary movement for various reasons that you have also
Yes.
listed
Yes.
with M.N. Roy and Chatto. And that is very interesting chapter. And in the beginning of the last question, you said about the communists itself, these violent revolutionaries itself having variety of ideas about how to get the freedom, who to align with, etc., etc. And this is where I want to bring in Lenin. Lenin and Roy shared a very good bond, but they had a different idea about the India's freedom movement, about how to get
Yes.
freedom for India. Could you reflect a bit on that?
Yeah. So, and also talking about violent revolutionary methods, both Chatto and Roy, when they started out, they were angry young men. And as they read more, especially Roy, as he read about Marxism, communism, and, met Soviet communists, they both realized that revolution can only be scattered. You need a new philosophy like the Bolsheviks had when they overthrew the aristocracy. And therefore, they sort of, I mean, Emin Roy writes about that. He said, I'm no longer, I mean, he says, not in these words exactly, but I'm no longer a bomb thrower or a revolutionary. Now I have moved to a different philosophy which can uplift India. And at that time, for him, that was communism, though he gave it up later. So yes, and when Roy and Lenin were very close. Roy was Lenin's protege. Unfortunately, Lenin died not too long after in 1924. But Roy and Lenin had different views on the India thesis. Lenin believed that the communists, the Bolsheviks, should ally with the Congress because he thought that the Congress is the largest party. It's the party with the biggest reach, and communist movements in India are very fledgling. They can't make an impact. So we need to ally with the Congress until India gets independence from the British rule, and after that we can see about bringing in more communist elements within the Congress. And at the time, Roy completely disagreed because he thought that the Congress was completely bourgeois and in alliance with, big zamindars and landlords and, big businessmen like the Birlas and the Tatas. And he completely disagreed. But later, he changed his mind because he himself was expelled from the Comintern when Stalin was in power. And he had no choice but to return to India because he was wanted by the police in literally every place. And if he had stayed on in Soviet Russia, he was very likely to meet the fate of Chatto. He escaped just in time. So Emin Roy returns to India and he is expelled from Comintern. Sorry, this comes first. He was expelled from Comintern because by this time, even though he had done his best to encourage communism in India and there was a fledgling communist movement in India, it was not developed. And he said very clearly that India needs to ally with the Congress. And this is what caused Comintern to call him also a bourgeois. This is the tendency of communists. Like everything, you're either with us or against us. There is nothing. There's no gray area. And this is why Comintern expelled him. And they said, you have completely taken the side of bourgeois. He was accused of being a British spy, which he wasn't. Okay, he was just a realist, he was a pragmatist. He came back to India and he joined the Congress. He was jailed, and after he was finally released from jail, his health was broken. He was a different man. He joined the Congress, but and tried to compromise with Gandhi and Nehru, but could not compromise because it's essentially Gandhi was, a Puritan, a religious person, a person who believed you know, uh, in religion and certain narrow political views that Roy did not share because Roy had spent too many years abroad. Roy was a hedonist, he was a rationalist, he believed in science, he did not believe in religion, superstition, any of those things. So eventually he was pushed out from even the Congress by Gandhi. And Roy was also very scathing of Nehru. He thought he was a vain demagogue and all those kind of things. And that does not endear yourself to people. He did not know how to endear himself to people beyond his small coterie.
So this Roy was an international figure, but one thing that keeps troubling me was how were Indian communists not swept by him? Like, why they also kind of see him as a pariah, somebody, an outsider? Why did Indian communists did not actively embrace Roy? Because we don't see
So
Roy anywhere in the
yeah,
party.
one of the challenges of this book, because as I keep saying, it's a popular history, and this book is meant to be read by everyone. It is not meant to be read by scholars. It's meant to be read by everybody from, say, my mom to a young student to anybody who doesn't know about these people. So, one of my huge challenges was to condense all this complicated communist history into quite a short book. Okay. And I don't know if I've managed it entirely. I think some readers would have liked more communist philosophy. I mean, it's very confusing because I've had reviews from just about everybody by now. And some reviewers says we want more communist philosophy, and some reviewers have said we want less communist philosophy and less names and places and people. It's so complicated, and it's very hard to find that balance. I tried not to get too much into complicated communist philosophy, but briefly, the Communist Party has, two sections. And one section was very against Roy because they believed that he jumped the gun in, founding a communist party in Tashkent with only 6 or 7 people. And he took all the credit for that. And he was a very charismatic man. Apparently, he had film star good looks and, he was surrounded by women. And he only had to walk into a room to enrapture the whole room. And there was a certain amount of envy and also a lot of, for instance, Chatto was elbowed out by Roy. Chatto too wanted the patronage of Lenin and the Bolshevik Party, but Chatto was completely elbowed out by Roy because Roy got in first and managed to enrapture and capture Lenin's heart. So there was a lot of dissension in the communist movement because they felt that, hello, here's this guy, happily swanning around Soviet Russia, China, etc., and taking all the credit while we are working to, you know, found this, build the foundations of the Communist Party in India. And so there are different sort of, views on that. And of course, after Roy said that the Indian communists need to ally with the Congress until we get independence and work within the Congress. After that, he was persona non grata. So, he was called a British spy, he was called all kinds of things because they just didn't believe in him. Later, when Roy, you know, moved away from the Congress and started radical humanism, he became completely irrelevant because radical humanism is a very attractive philosophy, especially in 2025. But it's quite an impractical philosophy. Most people did not think it would work. And therefore, he had a very small following of people who kind of believed in him. And he just became, like this sort of crank, that man who can't get along with anybody, fights with everybody, does silly things, and, just sits there with his, talking about radical humanism in an India which in 1947 was completely caste based, religion based, communal based. There was no getting away from that back then. So even now, there's no getting away from it. Hmm.
What's this radical humanism? Can you tell us a bit about that?
So, radical humanism was a philosophy that Roy started after he left the Congress, after he was sort of pushed out of the Congress by Gandhi. Uh, and by this time, he had already seen Joseph Stalin's excesses, and he had gone from being a fan of Stalin to being a critic of Stalin. And radical humanism is not entirely new because there are many humanist philosophies across the world, but it's a bit new in India. Roy, by this time, believed that religion was wrong, caste was wrong. He believed he wanted a renaissance for India where, people would be uh, judged as individuals rather than as groups of from whatever religion, caste, region you belong to. And he also did not believe in collectivism anymore after seeing Stalin's Great Purge, and he believed in individualism. So radical humanism is about individuals basically, and he did not even believe in he did not even believe in political parties. He had this very sort of idealistic idea that there'll be groups of highly intellectual, educated people, and people like doctors, engineers, scientists who will nominate a person who will lead that area, and then all these people will nominate another person. And in the book, I haven't gone, I mean, Roy was a very, very erudite but also a very verbose man. I mean, he wrote so much. He wrote over 20 books and innumerable articles, pamphlets, letters. There was literally not, thing in the world that was not commented upon by Roy. Like even remote happenings in Vietnam, China, somewhere in Europe, he would write a letter about it or write a pamphlet about it. And all this was sort of, kept in by his devoted wife. Uh, so my challenge was to sort of condense that. And I haven't gone into too much detail in radical humanism because there are 11 theses and it just goes on and on and on. But I do think that it was a very impractical philosophy. And in a way, I mean, the beauty of India is that even an uneducated person can vote. So I am in disagreement with Roy about, we should only educated people should come forward. And also, I don't think it still is a practical philosophy. We are not yet free of caste, religion, jati and all that. So it's a very attractive philosophy, but yeah, I don't think it would have worked out in the long run. And he had his own institute, and all that, but it never made he couldn't win elections. The start in India is to win elections. You have to be politically savvy. And as I said, I say in the book, the Guardian obituary of him said that, Emin Roy had such an exciting career, but he didn't have any actual impact in the end. I'm reading it now. Emin Roy had the most extraordinary career of a man of his generation in Asia. It was of interest out of proportion to his actual achievements. Yeah. So it was so interesting, but in the end, it didn't come to that much. Okay. Though I won't say that it came to zero. I do think that they contributed in many ways. And the obituary gets even more savage. He had little skill in party maneuver. Electorally, his party counted for nothing before or after independence. And, you know, a certain amount of political savviness is necessary to make an impact in India. And we have seen this with every idealistic political party. I mean, look at the Aam Aadmi Party, where it started and where it is now. So, this is India crushes idealists, really.
No, I think I want to go back a little bit. We were talking
Yes,
about
sure.
charismatic men these people were and the women in their life, right? One woman which actually connects Emin Roy and Chatto, and which I think I get a sense that one of the reasons for enmity between those two men was this extraordinary woman called Agnes Medley, to whom you have
Sure.
dedicated a complete chapter. Tell us about her.
Absolutely. So Agnes Medley is so fascinating that she deserves a book in itself, and there have been books written about her as well. And I just want to say to any readers who are listening, like, with my earlier book, Lady Doctors, nearly all the readers were women. And they all wrote it to me. I still get letters. People are still reading that book. It's still in print. It's been 4.5 years. And people are still writing to me saying it was so great to read about women because you never get to read about women and their stories and their lives and their viewpoints instead of just reading about men all the time. So I should just like to point out that even though that this is a book about two men, there is a lot about women in it. And there is a whole chapter devoted to Agnes Smedley, a fascinating woman. Okay, so Agnes Smedley was an American working class woman. She grew up in a very poor family in Missouri, with an alcoholic dad and many siblings, and just generally a terrible family life. And she later became a journalist, and she met Lala Lajpat Rai in New York and was completely, influenced by him, not in a romantic way, in a mentor kind of way. And she began thinking about why can't India get independence and have a revolution in the same way that Soviet Russia has done? And which was a quite a novel idea at the time. She got involved with with the Gadar movement, who were Indian revolutionaries who had gone to the US, in mostly in California and the Pacific Northwest. And she met a lot of them, and she was very influenced by them. She At that time she was a complete Indophile. He met Emin Roy there and his first wife, Evelyn Roy, and she knew of them. She, in fact, met Emin Roy before she met Chatto. She got involved in the Gadar movement, and the police came after her. Emin Roy escaped to Mexico, and Agnes Smedley escaped to Berlin because there were a lot of revolutionary Indians in Berlin at the time. And she came to Berlin to escape being arrested. There she met Chatto, and she fell head over heels for Chatto at the time, and they had a very tumultuous, passionate, but eventually horribly toxic and damaging relationship for years. They never married. She considered herself his common law wife, but they lived together. And here we come to the crux of all revolution, which is that it is very interesting, very easy to be a revolutionary on the streets. But can you be a revolutionary at home? Most people can't, and I would go so far as to say most men can't, because I've seen this in my previous book as well, in Lady Doctors, where men were very keen to talk about, you know, liberalization and education for women. But in practice, they just weren't able to live with a liberal and educated woman and with a woman who wouldn't be bossed about by them. They found it very hard. So this is exactly what happened with Agnes and Chatto. To begin with, she thought that Chatto would be a very open-minded, liberal, revolutionary person, but he wasn't. He had issues with her previous romantic relationships, previous boyfriends. In fact, she writes a very, uh, you know, heartfelt letter in which she says, Chatto just saw me as a walking vagina. And he was very jealous of all the previous relationships that I had had, even though he had had plenty of previous relationships, but he couldn't take me as a person now. Then Chatto began to use her mostly as a household slave, because Chatto used to invite all the Berlin revolutionaries to his house and make Agnes cook and clean for them, at least according to her account. We don't have an account of what Chatto says. I wasn't able to find anything where he spoke about her. Okay, he didn't speak about her or write about her as far as I know, but she wrote to many people, and many other people have said that Agnes completely became a household drudge for Chatto. She did all the cooking, the cleaning. He took money from her. They lived in complete poverty in Berlin. It was a very difficult life. I should say also that Agnes had certain mental issues, and perhaps so did Chatto. Okay, it wasn't easy to live that life back then. And, they were constantly pursued by the police, living in poverty. And eventually, Agnes and Chatto parted ways. She left him. And he was very, very hurt by that. And he was very, very lonely. But she didn't want to be his. By that time, he had become very controlling and he wouldn't let her write. She was writing for all kinds of newspapers. She was a journalist and a foreign correspondent. Agnes left Chatto and went on to great things. She went to China. By this time, she had got completely fed up of the Indian nationalists, because another very important point is that the Berlin Indians and other nationalists, they treated Agnes quite simply as a whore, as a kept woman, because she and Chatto were not married. So they treated M.N. Roy's wife, Evelyn Roy, and later Ellen Roy with respect because they were married. And both Evelyn Roy and Ellen Roy were, sort of like good Indian wives. They subordinated the entire lives to the men, and they did not write anything. They just, encouraged their men and served as sort of unpaid secretaries and archivists. Whereas Agnes wanted a life of her own. And there is also an incident in her book that I write about. She wrote many books, but she wrote a book called Daughter of the Earth, which was a novel about her life, a fictionalized account of basically her life with the Indian nationalists. And in that, she writes about she was actually raped by an Indian revolutionary, one of the group, one of the Gadar group. She does not mention this person. She gives everybody fake names, and there are all kinds of theories. One theory is that it was a man called Harambalal Gupta, which seems to me the most convincing theory. He's not very well known, but he was part of the early Gadar movement. There is one biographer of Agnes Medley has even said that it was M.N. Roy. I could not find anything to confirm this because there is nothing to confirm this. But it is a fact that M.N. Roy despised Agnes Medley and made her life very difficult. Uh, he even said that if Chatto had not got involved with Agnes Medley, he would have gone so much further and I would have been happy to work with Chatto. But this hysterical woman, he calls her all kinds of terrible things. He calls her, an evil genius, hysterical woman, a witch, this or that. And all this smacks of this complete Indian chauvinism towards any woman who has her own life, who has her own relationships, who refuses to be a household drudge, who does her own writing, all that kind of thing. And Emin Roy calls her a lot of names, and it's quite strange. And for some part of me thinks, why were you so uh, you know, uh, outspoken against her, and why did you hate her so much? It's possible they could have had a relationship, okay? And neither of them talked about it, but she writes about it in a disguised way in her book. Her book is interesting as well, Daughter of the Earth. And but he goes on talking about her in her memoir as a complete witch and all. And eventually, partly because of her, he elbowed Chatto out and he got in with Lenin and basically marginalized Chatto. So anyway, long story short, Smedley left Chatto. She went to China, where she became fascinated by Mao, who was a young man at the time, and the Maoist movement. And she became a first correspondent and marched with Mao with his Red Army in, the Mao blue fatigues and, Mao uniform. And eventually she became so enamored of China that when she finally died, she was buried in China, in Beijing, in the, a cemetery there for revolutionaries. And Chatto and Smedley met for one last time in Moscow, by which time, much time had passed and, they were amicable towards each other. And Chatto in Smedley actually writes very movingly of Chatto, and she says he's become old, he's in exile, he wants to return to India, he's very lonely, but he can't. And so he's, stuck between two pearls. And then they part. And Smedley never got to know about Chatto's execution. They just lost complete touch and eventually she died. I think in a different time and in a different place, they could have had a very wonderful relationship, but both of them had terrible issues. So, I titled that chapter because Smedley said when she left Missouri, she said, I will never want to be like my mother, a household drudge, just, cooking and cleaning and looking after children. And she writes, live the life of a cabbage, I would not. And that's why she left Chatto. And luckily for her, she did not live the life of a cabbage, though I'm sure she led a quite lonely life because, no man would of that time could put up with a woman like Agnes Smedley.
No, even Ellen Roy
Yeah.
was with Roy when Roy passed away in 1954.
Yeah.
Half a decade after that, she was murdered in very mysterious
Yes.
circumstances, which we don't know why, right?
Correct.
I want to ask this particular question, which I actually have seen in the lives of many freedom fighters, many well-known figures.
Yeah.
While they are prolific figures in the public, right? They are terrible husbands, as are terrible partners, right? Why is this? Or do you see a trend here?
I do see a trend. And yeah, let me just say, like, I've gone on and on about Agnes Medley for probably quite a long time, but every single person who has read the book and who came to my readings, uh, and actually every reviewer seems to have liked that chapter on Agnes Medley more than anything else because it shows the flaws of revolutionaries. Very hard to be a revolutionary at home. Okay. Yeah, I have seen this trend everywhere. It's really, you know, there are so many men who say they want their wives to be, revolutionaries like them and to be liberal and to be open and to, follow their own paths and discover themselves. But in practice, this is almost impossible or it never happens. As you said, Roy married twice and had lots of love affairs as well. His first wife was Evelyn Roy, an American woman who completely changed her entire life to follow Roy around the world. And again, she had a very difficult life. They could never settle anywhere, they were constantly pursued. And she was such a helpmeet and devoted wife to Roy. She helped him meet other communists in Mexico. She went to Mexico with him, and with her contact, she helped him meet other Americans. She helped him research all his books. She was actually a very good writer in her own right, but she did never wrote in her own name. Everything was, to help Roy. And eventually the reward, and she was not actually much of an Indophile. The only reason she went to that cause is because of Roy's charisma. And, Sid Narayan Ray, who was a disciple of Roy's, writes about how Evelyn met Roy for the first time. She was so impressed by his, his good looks, his charisma, his intellect, all of that she was completely bowled over. The reward she got for this was to be dumped by Roy. Uh, and of course, there are two sides to every story, to every marriage, but nevertheless, the eventual result was that Roy dumped her, uh, around the time that he was, on, trips for the Comintern and going to various countries. Uh, he just told her that, this is it. We have grown out of each other and, you go back to the US. And she took it very badly because quite naturally she felt that she has changed her entire life for Roy and she has no life of her own anymore. And she went back to the US, and I do believe she eventually married again. Meanwhile, Roy had, a few glamorous girlfriends among the revolutionary movement. And yeah, so he married Ellen Gottschalk, who became Ellen Roy, another very devoted woman who completely, who lived in India. Not easy to live in India as a foreign woman, dressed in saris, waited for Roy while he was in jail. When he emerged, helped him to found the radical humanism movement, served as a hostess, completely gave up any career of her own and only, helped him set up, his archive of letters, writing, etc. And eventually, yes, Roy passed away in 1953, sorry, maybe 54, of a fall. And Ellen carried on the work in Dehradun. They lived in Dehradun and carried on the work of the radical humanist movement. But she was savagely murdered by two young boys. And there was a lot of talk about that. Was it a conspiracy? Things like that. But I think it was just for money, the kind of thing that happens all across India every day. And they took advantage of a, lone woman and they murdered her for money. And she, after Roy passed, she wrote quite wistfully and I think with some regret that I have given up my entire life for Roy. Anything that I could have achieved in my life, my name is not known, only his name is known. And it seems like such a completely foolish decision for someone of my education because she was also very highly educated and well read. But the thing with Roy is that when he walked into the room, you forgot everything you know. In fact, when I did that podcast with Amit Verma, we had some fun because he was like, if this was made into a movie or a TV show, who would you have as, all the playing all these characters? And I had no idea because I wasn't thinking of it in those terms, but we agreed that we would have Manoj Bajpayee for Chatto, and he suggested this guy Ranveer Kapoor for um, for M.N. Roy. I'm not sure I can see that, to be honest. I feel like if Soumitra Chatterjee had been alive now, he would have made a fantastic M.N. Roy, because he was, had so much charisma and, good looks and was tall and all that. And so we had a bit of fun with that. But yeah, I'm not sure who should play them, really.
These complicated lives. But if it was made to a web series, you should please invite us for the premiere. That's one request.
I so wish it would be made into a web series with lady doctors. There was so much talk. I had so many approaches, but all of them came to nothing. I do believe that making a web series is very complicated, and quite often you get a lot of interest which actually comes to nothing. So, anyway, I hope so. I really hope it does get made into a web series, because I feel like it will lend itself to one, as long as, they don't make it add too much masala. I feel like there's enough masala in the story that you don't need to add anything. So,
No, it surely takes time because I remember reading this article by Ram Guha about how the Gandhi film has come about, right? And even it had taken decades and trials and tribulations to finally get a movie on Mr. Gandhi.
right.
So I think we should surely look forward to that. I want to go back a little bit, too much of Roy. Let's go back to Chatto, right?
Sure.
And one more character about Chatto. I mean, Chatto got sucked into this wider story, which is spearheaded by somebody called Baron Max von Oppenheim, who had a
Yeah.
very interesting story. So tell us the story of Oppenheim.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many interesting characters in this book. Okay, I mean, their lives were so interesting and fascinating. The people they met were like, it would make the world's, most interesting dinner party if all these people were at a dinner party. And another thing that I wanted to talk about, which is relevant, so I'm going a little bit off topic, sorry about that, but the structure of the book. Uh, I wondered if we could talk about that slightly before we go to your question, which is that the structure of the book is one chapter Roy, one chapter Chatto. One chapter Roy, one chapter Chatto. Or rather, it's the other way around. One chapter Chatto, one chapter Roy. That's how I started. And because they were rivals, but they didn't meet until 1920, but they knew of each other because the Indian revolutionary world was a very small world at the time. And they could hear and know of each other, and in the end they were both sort of rivals for money and power and all that kind of thing. And so that is what I've done. And because I am a journalist, I was a journalist and I still am a journalist and I do a lot of journalistic writing. I wanted the book to be very interesting above all. I didn't want to write a scholarly book which nobody would read. Therefore, every chapter begins with an interesting anecdote, and that's where we come to your story. So, one chapter begins with Baron Max von Oppenheim. Every chapter begins with an interesting anecdote, so that, like, in journalistic style, so that the reader reads further. Okay. And some people have liked this, and some people, mostly historians, have not liked. It's historians who have had an issue with this, because they were like, why can't you write chronologically from starting from 1850 to 1882? Chatto was born in etc. in Hyderabad, and Roy was born here in Arbelia. But to me, that would have made it a very boring book and not popular history. So I didn't take that route. Anyway, so as you were saying, Chatto and Baron Max von Oppenheim, who was also known as a Kaiser's spy. Okay, so Baron Max von Oppenheim was a German uh, diplomat, archaeologist, and sort of Renaissance man and man about town, really. And he was also Jewish, and he had a very interesting background, because he came from a very wealthy family, which gave him the chance to explore interests like archaeology. And he actually dug up a very famous archaeological site called Tel Halaf, which is in modern day Syria. And he excavated that, and there was a whole museum with his finds and etc etc. But in his other life, he was a German diplomat who faced a lot of troubles because he was a Jew at around the time that, you know, Jewish people were slowly being, demonized and, all that, though that came later, but, the seeds of that. And therefore, he had to prove his worth. And he was fascinated with the Middle East. He learned Arabic and spent a lot of time in Egypt and, in other Middle Eastern countries. And he and the Kaiser at the time, Kaiser William II, the German Kaiser, decided and believed that one way to, get back and hit back at the British Empire, one way to kind of, sort of uh, make the British Empire less powerful was to ally with uh, Muslims. Okay. And especially, the rising power of Muslims in Turkey and in Egypt and in India as well, because there were a lot of Muslim nationalist movements as well, like the Khilafat movement. So his idea was to have, Oppenheimer's idea was to have a sort of jihad, okay, by which he meant that Muslims would ally with the Germans to drive the British out. And Chatto got on board with this because he was in Berlin at the time with the other Berlin Indians. And there was a lot of to and fro for years in which they tried many, you know, tactics. It's all very confusing and complicated. Many tactics to unite Muslims in Afghanistan, in India, in Turkey, in Egypt, and so forth. It all came to nothing because there was so much dissension amongst them. They just couldn't agree. And then the Kaiser also lost interest, which is why, Oppenheimer was called the Kaiser's spy because he was doing all these things. They put out a lot of propaganda. They tried their best, but eventually it all came to nothing because of the might of the British Empire. And, the Germans just lost interest in working with the Indians because the Indians were so disorganized. We do also tend to forget that the British Empire in its heyday, for such a small island, was incredibly powerful. And now, of course, it's a small island struggling economy once again. But back then, it was incredibly powerful and its reach was across the world. And its Secret Service clamped down so hard on these Indians that eventually they just gave up. And, eventually Baron Max von Oppenheim just gave up this idea. It came to nothing.
This is interesting because we see a kind of trying to bring in a pan-Islamism uh, to go against Britain. One more failed experiment. I don't know if I can call it failed. Again, involvement of Chatto is this League Against Imperialism that was formed to include the colonized countries. Again,
Sure.
talking about the global anti-imperialism movement.
Yes.
Tell us about the vision of it and the influence it had in its afterlife.
So the League of Imperialism was one of Chatto's bright ideas, and I don't consider it a complete failure. So at the time, Chatto allied with a German communist called Willy Munzenberg, who was a sort of, I call him a communist influencer in my book because that is what he was. He was a real, powerful in getting support for the communist cause. He traveled all across the world. He had lots of contacts, media. He was like a sort of communist mogul. In fact, the chapter on him is called The Red Millionaire. Okay. Quite a controversial figure, and there are, whole books about him as well. But he allied with Chatto to form an organization called the League Against Imperialism, which was sort of like a UN, but for the colonized nations. Because at the time, the colonies, Britain, Germany, France, Spain, they called all the shots, Belgium, they called all the shots and, you know, were responsible for terrible atrocities, as we know from Britain's, record in India. And therefore, Chatto decided that we need a League of Nations for colonized countries, for people like India, Sri Lanka, African countries, Indonesia, and all that. And so this started. And in the beginning, it went very well. And Jawaharlal Nehru attended, the League Against Imperialism, and several important people, attended it. And it greatly influenced some of the colonies in their later fights against British imperialism. But eventually that also collapsed because it became too communist. Okay. And Chatto by this time was a fervent communist. He completely antagonized Nehru by writing constant letters to him saying, why don't you break away from Gandhi, from this obscurantist and this, this sort of, this religious nutter, and, go your own way, and, become more socialist, because Gandhi is enthralled to the Birlas and the Tatas and, the other important businessmen. And he wrote a series of very scathing letters, savage letters to Nehru, and Nehru was not having any of this because, as he pointed out to Chatto, you have been away from India for years. You have no idea what we are doing on the ground here and how we are suffering. And I do think that, this has been the thing of communism all along, is that that sort of sanctimony really puts people off. Okay. And Nehru and Chatto's relationship, broke up after that, even though Nehru and Chatto were very good friends, and Nehru, in fact, had visited Chatto in Berlin and all that. But Nehru and Chatto's relationship broke up after that. Nehru stopped responding to his letters because Chatto were just constantly dashing off letters saying, do this, do that, break away from Gandhi. And Nehru believed above all in Congress unity, as we know. And he too believed that while he had many differences with Gandhi, Gandhi was the only one who could unite India. Okay. And he could see the dissension. Nehru did not have a good opinion of the various revolutionaries scattered across Europe, except for perhaps Chatto and Roy. He believed that they would all come to nothing because they were so disunited. And there were so many controversies about things like money. One half would accuse the other half of appropriating money. There were lots of cheats, as Oppenheim found out. There were lots of people in the pan-Islamic movement who would take money from Germany and say we are using it for, independence and for the revolutionary cause, and then use it for their own purposes. So there were all kinds of things going on. And therefore, Nehru felt that the only way you can do this is to have Congress party, which already is known across India, stay united. Chatto did not agree. So after that, the League Against Imperialism broke up because it became very strongly communist. And by this time, people were having severe issues with communism and were beginning to see how communism was working in practice. And I wouldn't call it a complete failure at all, because I think it was a very important legacy, because later Nehru borrowed from this idea for his non-aligned movement. And while he did not acknowledge Chatto, because by then they were not on speaking terms, other people from, the Indonesian President Sukarno uh, acknowledged that uh, it was the League Against Imperialism that had influenced the non-aligned movement. For the first non-aligned summit in the 1950s, many people acknowledged the League Against Imperialism. Though I don't think they acknowledged Chatto by name, but they acknowledged League Against Imperialism for influencing this. Just for the idea that colonized nations can have a say, and we don't need to let the colonies have, their say in everything. And of course, the non-aligned movement worked for many years, and now, of course, we are once again in complete chaos. The geopolitical order now is complete chaos, according to me, and the UN has become completely powerless to do anything. But I think Chatto, this was one of Chatto's contributions to the world, if only it had worked better.
Now, let me push you to a very opinion-based question. The old William Dalrymple controversy that happened last year, the conflict between the
Mhm.
WhatsApp history, academic history, and the popular history. Now, you being a
Mhm.
popular historian yourself, what do you think about the question that the WhatsApp history has risen only because academic historians were not able to capture the audience to the true history? And how did academic historians receive your work?
So I agree to some extent with Dalrymple, but there are many reasons why popular history is still fledgling in India, though it's taking off now. Okay. It's taking off now. And I should say that I'm not a trained historian. My degree is in law. I used to be a lawyer, then I became a journalist, then I became a sort of historian. Uh, I would say that my skill, such as it is in breaking down huge chunks of, you know, unreadable scholarly material into an easy and readable account for a non-historian, for a normal person to read. And this is what popular historians do the world over. They break down all this scholarly stuff because there's plenty of scholarly stuff. Even in Lady Doctors, my last book, there are lots and lots of PhD theses about the doctors and very scholarly books. And for this book, I must acknowledge Professor Nirod Barua, who is an academic who lives in Germany, and Professor Sidnarayan Ray, who are acknowledged, and some other academics who have contributed a great deal in doing the primary research. But their books are not in print, they're not accessible, they're very long, and they're not for everybody, they're for academics. Okay. So I think Dalrymple is right in that way that we need more popular historians. We need people like Tom Holland, Peter Frankopan. We need people like that, uh, Bettany Hughes. These are popular historians, in the West who are very, very popular. Mary Beard. Some of them are even trained historians. Some of them are not. Dalrymple himself, I don't think, is a trained historian. I think and for that matter, Ram Guha is not a trained historian. He studied economics as an undergraduate. Okay. So I do think we need more popular histories. The problem comes when you look at the resources that Indian writers have. I have said many, many times that neither Lady Doctors nor this book would have been written if it were not for the fact that I moved to London in 2020, and it was a very serendipitous move. It came out of nowhere. I got the chance to move. It was not planned. It happened in the pandemic, and we just took a chance and went for it. It was a very good move for me because I finally had access to libraries. Before that, I was in Bangalore where I have no access to no libraries. So, none of this is in Indian libraries. And what there is mostly in the National Archives in Delhi, which is quite difficult to access. So, if you are not a Delhi based historian, or if you don't, let me talk about another thing. So here, most of this book was released, researched in a British library, which I'm very grateful for. Uh, Second thing is that nobody talks about a very important question: money. Money makes the world go round. We can sit here and talk about, muses and writing what we want to write, and, writing what the heart desires and blah, blah. But I'm a very practical person, and nobody talks about money. The advances of Indian publishers are very low, and there is mostly no money for research. There is no money for travel unless you are like, at the top, like Guha or Manu Pillai. There is hardly any money to do any of these things. There's no budget. And the reason for that is not because publishers are evil and want to keep all the money to themselves. It's because not many people read in India. Even like a bestseller in India is something that sells 15,000 or 20,000 copies. But a bestseller in the West is like, 200,000, 300,000 copies. And a bestseller in India is like 15,000 copies. And most books in India sell no more than 1,000 copies. All this posturing that you see on social media, I am reading this book, I am reading that book, book talk, Instagrammers, these books are not selling. They are selling 1,000 copies or 2,000 copies, except for very few. And most of those are, celebs, like books written by, say, a Birla, or books written by Kareena Kapoor or something like that. So very few books are actually selling. Uh, and we don't know what makes a book sell, because it's not necessarily guaranteed that a good book will sell. Okay. Or that a bad book won't sell. So there is very little money for non-fiction writers to research and travel. And research and travel can take a huge amount of money. A huge amount of money. Now, ideally, if I had the money, I should have traveled to the Netherlands. I should have traveled to Germany. I should have traveled to Paris. I should have traveled to Soviet Russia. I should have traveled to Mexico, where the events of this book happened. But frankly, there's no budget for that. And frankly, I cannot afford that, no personal budget. So this is the things that you have to contend with. Grants. There are very few grants that Indian writers can apply for. There is just one called the New India Foundation, which I'm very grateful for because it sponsored Shrikar Raghavan's book, and it's doing great work. But that's for post-independent India. So my book didn't qualify, neither Lady Doctors nor this book qualified, because most of my book is pre-independence India. So there's that. And in the UK, I tried to apply for a couple of grants. Several of them I was not eligible for because of citizenship issues, because of age issues, because of various other things. A lot of them say that you have to have an offer from a British publisher to get a grant, which I don't yet have because this has been published in India. So it becomes very difficult. And when Dalrymple says we need more writers like Peter Frankopan, which he said, here's the thing, both Dalrymple and Peter Frankopan are from extremely wealthy families. I don't think they disguise it, aristocracy, and they have the money to travel, research, consult various libraries across the world, which most people don't have. And I'm very privileged to be able to live in London. Without living in London, I could not write this book. Okay, because it took so many months of research. It took, it took months just to write the proposal that I sent to Westland. And I could not have afforded to come to London, which is the world's most expensive city, and stay in a hotel and research all this in the British Library. So there's my privilege coming in that I actually live in London. I don't know how people living in India do it because they only have the National Archives, and there's hardly, not everything is in the National Archives. So this is, if you want more popular history in India, you need to find a way of getting more money, more grants, more better libraries, and help writers to access all these things, which at the moment is not happening. But I do agree that we need to write history in an easy and accessible way because nobody is reading any books. And I think Manu Pillai, who has been very kind and very encouraging of my work, uh, even though he is young enough to be my son, but nevertheless, he does this very well. He does a lot of videos, he does a lot of podcasts on popular history, and that, you know, uh, interests people and brings them in to read his books. Uh, and there are people who are doing it now. Popular history is taking off in India. I do think this is a golden age for nonfiction because, like I said, Shrikar's book, brilliant popular history. Manu Pillai's book, brilliant popular history. Ira Mukoti, who I know and whose work I love, another brilliant popular historian who is not also a trained scholar, but who manages to find that balance. But it's tricky. And I have to say that a lot of historians have not liked my book. Okay. Like I had a launch in Hyderabad where the moderator was a historian, and I don't think he liked the book very much because he was like, no, but we need more of communist philosophy. And I was like, if boss, nobody reads books. If you put in more of communist philosophy, even less people will read. This is how I feel. Very few people read books. So when you see writers, perhaps, when historians see writers perhaps pandering to the public, uh, I think we are writing for two completely different audiences. Historians are writing to be peer reviewed by their own colleagues and by other scholars, and popular historians are writing for the general public, so the two can coexist. You can have your scholarly history. I think there is room for many more scholarly books on Chatto and Roy, especially Roy. uh, and we can also have the popular histories to at least let people know that these men existed, and to at least let them enjoy a really good story. So you can have both. I see no reason why you can't have both. Does that answer your question, or have I just rambled here and there?
No, I have one more question, which I need to
Yes,
ask.
please.
You have already mentioned this in the very beginning, which is most of the reviews that you're getting for this book, Spies, Lies, and Allies, is from men. And for lady doctors, it's from women, right? And also, you being a woman historian, do you think
Mm.
these gender also plays role in readership, and what kind of challenges would you face? I mean, in a very exaggerated, like, what if you're a man? Could you have written more or got more
It's
audience?
hard. It's
Gender.
hard to say because we don't have any data on this. I think what I said is that more women read Lady Doctors. As far as I know, this book is still, finding its place because it takes time also for a book to, there's still publicity going on. There's still reviews are still appearing. I think more women read that book, and my sense of people who have written to me for Spies, Lies, and Allies is that more men are reading this book, particularly a lot of older men, you know. And I don't know why that is. It's probably because a lot of Indian women are just sick of reading about men, hearing about men, talking about men, because India is still a very patriarchal country. And they're just fed up. They're like, enough already about men. Okay. So, and then a lot of men, okay, this is an actual incident that happened. So you can take it or leave it as you feel. I don't have data, but certainly when uh, on the tour for this book, Spies, Lies, and Allies, which I did very recently about like, in March, I went to Delhi, Hyderabad, and Bangalore. And an old classmate of mine turned up in Delhi. I was very happy to see him. And he said, "What are you doing now?" I said, "I've started writing books for what it's worth." And then I told him about Lady Doctors. And he said, "Yes, yes, I've seen that in all the shops. It's still in the shops." And then he said, "Kavita, I'm never going to read that book." And I was like, "Why?" He's like, "No, no, about women." I was like, "You don't need to be alarmed. There's no, there's no a sort of intimate gynecological detail in that book. It's just a book about women doctors." No, 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 women, all that, I don't want to read all that. But this book I'll definitely read. I said, okay, I mean, whatever you want to read, I can't force anyone to read anything. But this is something, and this incident is at least the fifth or sixth time a man has told me to my face that he's not going to read my book. There's too much suffering and depression. And I don't really feel that Lady Doctors is all that depressing. Yes, of course, it is a bit depressing because I mean, what can I do about it? They had difficult lives. I can't really make them running or run off and have affairs and stuff like that. Whereas Spies, Lies, and Allies, if you want to call it that, is a more masala book simply because they were men. And they had the opportunity to do that. No Indian women were allowed to have affairs and run around and, do all that kind of stuff. They had to stick to their families back then. So, uh, anyway, this is what I'm sensing. One of my editors has told me, uh, and let's say I have got many good reviews for Spies, Lies, and Allies, by the way, from male reviewers. And then some people have had certain issues, and some of them I agree with, some of them I don't agree with, depending on whatever. Uh, you know, uh, one of my editors says that reviewers are always harsh on women historians. And it is, I do think that in India, popular history is dominated by men. And I've spoken about this many times on my social media. The problem is that if you talk about it too much, you sound like a whining victim. And I'm not any victim. I'm nobody's, victim. I'm not a victim. I'm an extremely privileged person in many ways. So let me point out that I'm not complaining as such about that. Having said that, when I've been doing the rounds of bookstops, on the table, which is like for nonfiction, the entire table is dominated by male writers. Ram Guha, Manu Pillai, both of whom are great writers. Let me just say that I think they're great writers. Dalrymple. Lately, there have been a number of, books by newer writers and, things like that, even from the New India Foundation. And, uh, other people like, say Akshay Mukul or other historians have written, a lot of journalists, especially, which I always welcome because I think these books written by journalists are great. And say your Rollo Romek, all these writers. And one of the reasons why is the fact that life is still very unfair. Most Indian women are looking after their children initially, are doing the bulk of childcare initially. Once the kids grow up, they then get roped into doing the bulk of elder care. So to leave your uh, house for several months, which is what non-fiction writing requires, several months of sustained research and thought and fact checking, is beyond them, which is why. so many Indian writers, women writers, are being pushed into writing easy books, or what people think of as easy. I'm not saying that they're easy exactly, but certainly they require less research, and they don't require libraries, and they don't require travel. So let's consider them easy in that sense. So they're being pushed into writing romantic fiction, which doesn't require research and travel. They're being pushed to a huge extent into writing children's books. Like, I know so many women historians, perhaps amateur historians, but they know a lot about history. And they are all writing books for children. Okay, perhaps, and I don't know why. I need to ask them sometimes, but it's a tricky topic because then they feel like you're saying, well, why shouldn't I write for children? Are you saying that's worse than writing for adults? Not worse, but different, right? Why is it that all the important books on Indian history are mostly written by men? And I think this is the reason why, because women can't take time off. For instance, if I was in Bangalore, there is no way I could have taken months and months off to traipse around London and go to the British Library for all this research. Let's even forget about the idea of traipsing across Europe and going to Germany and Russia and all those places. I couldn't do it. And I I think like this has been acknowledged by several male historians as well. You know, they always say, thank you so much to my wife for looking after my children while I spent 6 months on a fellowship in doing this and that. And it's never the other way around. No woman historian has gone off for a 6 month fellowship in New York, leaving their men to look after the children. And I am a very late bloomer myself. My first book appeared when I was nearly 42. And this is the reason why. Because for years I was busy occupied with children. And in the future, I expect to be occupied with elder care. I'm not yet occupied with that, but it's coming. And then, I just didn't have a moment or the sort of the bandwidth. I wrote other stuff, but I didn't have the bandwidth to think about writing complicated books. And it's a difficult issue because I don't think many other women historians are talking about this, because if we do, we sound like whining victims. And we don't want to sound like whining victims. But if you break down what is required to, do a nonfiction book, it requires all these things. It requires money, it requires time, it requires the ability to be away from your family for a while sometimes if you have to travel. This is the reason.
I hope more books from you now.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I'm exhausted after this book. But, a lot of people, yeah, I mean, just still talking on that subject, because one thing I didn't talk about is that a lot of people have told me, my editors have told me, and they might know more because I only have my own personal experience, is that, oh, well, there is data about this. Let me bring that in. There is data about this. If you do show notes or something, you can put that in. Maybe Amit Verma, I think, has put it in with my first book, with my earlier book, Lady Doctors. Uh, Women will read books written by men, but men will not read books written by women. There is data on this, solid data. They did a survey of men across the world, and all these men said, we won't read books written by women. So there is data on that. So women are told to write books that other women will read. And that is romance, light fiction, children's books, you know, books about that kind of book. Whereas men write the books that everybody will read. And this is a fact. Having said that, in India, most of the people who are reading my book appear to be men. But I would like everybody to read this book, because I don't think it's a man's book or a woman's book. It's just a book. It's a book that possibly everybody can read. People have told me that men will not read a book written by a woman. Okay, they have told me that, and uh, I don't know, but there is data to that effect. But I mean, what can you do about it? All you can do is write the best book that you can and just keep talking about it.
No, I hope it goes as a cycle. Certainly, because of very obvious reasons, the readership has gone down, and especially when it comes to the gender and reading, there is certainly a correlation to it. But I only hope that this reverses and everybody picks up a book. I want to see like more of reading in public, right? Because when we see these old black and white photos, I see so many people sitting in public and reading a book or in a chai shop, and we don't see it nowadays, right? So I keep
Everybody's on their phones. So
everybody on the phones. So I think it should be a cycle where people pick up the books and read in the cafes and parks and discuss about them in the public. That's one hope I have. I want to ask one last question, which is, what do you think is the final legacy that is left behind by Roy and Chatto, and why they are important figures to be read?
yeah, that's a very good question. But before going to that, I'll just take 2 minutes to talk about that
Yes.
previous thing. I think most people these days don't read, they don't have the time. And I think most people who are trying to sell anything to the public, be it books, be it products, be it anything, have to be very social media oriented. And I find this quite hard. Uh, and because I'm a late adapter to these things, I built up a huge, and even publishers want that, by the way, because when you suggest a book to a publisher, they always ask what platform you have, by which they mean social media. And I built up to around 15,000 followers on X before, and now I have almost completely left it. My account is still active, but I never post anymore because it's become completely toxic. And I got to the point where every time I posted anything, I felt like now I'm going to be attacked by some angry person, who is angry about something completely different, but feels the need to attack. A lot of these writers, for instance, Dalrymple, Manu Pillai, Dalrymple's son, Sam Dalrymple, who's like an up and coming historian, are doing a lot on social media, interesting on Instagram, is sharing interesting historical things. And that's what I'm trying to do. I'm only about 1,000 followers. But it's very hard because these days it's not enough to be a historian. You also have to share your personal life. And that I find very hard to do. I'm very uninterested in sharing about my family, my children, my husband, and all that. I don't want people to know about them. In fact, nobody knows, even the name of my husband or the name of my children. They don't appear on social media at all. And I'm not so keen to share all that stuff about my family. It's just not my thing. And not that these writers are doing that, because I feel like they are doing quite a good job of just sharing about history. But on social media, history doesn't progress very far. What people want is like either they want you to, be constantly prancing about, with a certain, how shall I put it, a certain sort of voyeurism element involved, or, they want you to share about things like, uh, your mental health issues or your sadness or your desperation, which again I don't do. Or they want you to share about things like food or fashion or makeup, or how to be younger, diet, and how to be fit and young. And again, that's not my space. So these things are very difficult, and I see that a lot of people are doing quite odd things in order to get a following. But then what kind of following do you want? And I struggle with this. How to make history approachable to people without sharing your entire life on the social media. So anyway, uh, that needs to be done though, because the thing is like, this is another thing, YouTube channels, podcasts. This is what historians need to do. And I have done none of these things yet because I'm such a slow adapter that, all I've done is write the book. Okay. And then, sort of cursorily on social media. And all these things now need to be done because most of India is very young, below 25, and they don't read books. I mean, like, my entire family is full of doctors. My father was a doctor, my aunts are doctors, my cousins are doctors. None of them actually read Lady Doctors. They just, said congratulations and left it at that. Other people are reading it. So it's very hard to make people read because most people in India work such long hours and have such long commutes that people don't read books. And I have toyed many times with the idea of making a podcast because, as you can see, I talk quite a lot. And but even a podcast, as you know very well, it's very hard to build from scratch. Takes years and years and years, but people are doing it. And then there are other tools, Substack, perhaps newsletters, YouTube videos. all these. I just haven't got around to doing any of that because I have actually written 4 books in 10 years. Spies, Lies, and Allies is actually my fourth book. It's not my first book. And I am now exhausted. 4 books in 10 years is a lot. So I have to take a nice long break now. Uh, no
No,
idea what the next book will be about.
here I want to add one thing. So I teach at a university, and what I find is when I go to a class, I mean, and tell the students certain snippets. For example, let's take the Spice, Lies, and Allies. And if I
Yeah,
go and tell the snippet of, for example, the Savarkar escape story, uh,
correct.
or for example, the story of how two white men had bought people from the Africa and made them zoo animals, right, as some different
Yeah,
exotic species, or the story of ant
yes,
medley. And when we tell these kinds of snippets, students surely pick up the books. The point is,
sure,
students don't know that these books exist because of the huge assignments and the rat race for academics that
correct,
we have right now. But I
correct,
think the point is, classroom is a transformative arena, and
sure.
who should read more books is the teachers first. I think that's very personal belief of mine, and tell these
Sure,
stories to students. And if they
absolutely.
are told the students, I'm sure everybody picks up those books, at least read excerpts from it, right? What more is needed?
Yeah,
uh,
but I mean, it's easier said than done because I have 2 children, young adults. One of them reads everything. She's read all my books several times. In fact, she consults with me on the book. I send her chapters and she reads everything. She's very, very, very widely read. And the other one, who is brought up in exactly the same way, doesn't read anything. And he gets his knowledge, and he's by no means unknowledgeable. He gets all his knowledge from YouTube. And this is a thing now. People get their knowledge from short videos. If they want to know something, they Google. And I was totally against this because I recently went on a trip to Florence and I got lots and lots of books out of the library. And my husband says, Boss, I don't have time to read that. I'm going to watch the short video on Florence. And actually, the video was great. So then when he said that, I also watched it and it told me so much. So even though I'm a massive reader, I also think knowledge can be found in various forms. So if people, I know Dalrymple said, oh, WhatsApp history. But if history can be disseminated in little snippets through, an engaging YouTube channel, I don't think there's anything wrong with that because we have to adapt to the way the world is today. I mean, one of my kids is working and she works all hours of the day. There is no time to read at all. So, when you have time, you just chill in front of Netflix and watch some absolute crap because your brain is completely, broken. Anyway, so yeah, but at the same time, I also feel like I feel very strongly about this. So I'm just going to put it in. I know I'm over time. I will answer your last question, but I feel so strongly that every city and every town in India needs libraries, and there are none. Like Bangalore used to have the British Consul. It's closed now except for an online presence, which people are using only, to get their cramming exam for IELTS or TOEFL or whatever. And I can't understand how we have so many beer joints and pubs and craft brewery and not one library. You have that central library in Cubbon Park, but I don't know if you've been there. It's not welcoming. You can't borrow books. And
and
you go sit there and the librarians just stare at you until you finally leave. Okay. And in fact, my second book, which didn't do well, sadly, but I'm still proud of writing it. It was about libraries because I'm obsessive about libraries. I am in the library every week in London. I'm very lucky to be able to access libraries here. And how is it that no Indian city has a proper library? Bombay has got some, Asiatic, JB Petit, which is why my second book, The Librarian, was about these libraries. Those also are not inviting, and people are using them mostly as a space to study. If you have to actually find a book, all the books are in disarray, damaged, leaking water. And I literally cannot understand how you can make a nation read when they have no libraries because not everybody can afford to buy a book. Currently, Spies, Lies, and Allies, I think it costs 250 rupees on Amazon, and the bookshops also have deals. But 250 rupees is a lot of money for some people. And uh, For many people, the only books that they have the time and the ability to buy is exam papers. In fact, I think India is the maybe one of the only countries in the world where the bestseller in every year is not any book. It is exam papers for various competitive exams, UPSC, IIT, this, that, and the other. So that is what people are actually reading, UPSC papers, because we are still a country where reading is a luxury. In fact, all through my childhood, every relative used to shout at me for reading and what use is reading, except for my parents who are very unconventional and let me read. Every other relative who came to the house said, why is your child always reading? What use is reading? Why don't you prepare for X and Y competitive exam? So that is how it is. Anyway, sorry, we have gone off tangent. You were talking about Chatto and Roy's legacy. So Chatto, I think his legacy lies in the fact that he was so staunchly anti-imperialist, anti British Empire right from the beginning. At the time when Gandhi and Nehru, like I said, were moderates, were pleading for dominion status, were making many compromises. And, I think in the book I refer to Gandhi and Nehru in the first chapter as mealy mouthed, because they were making these mealy mouthed compromises. And now I'm kind of regretting it because it gives the impression that I am denigrating Gandhi and Nehru for the way in which they went around achieving independence. And I'm not. I'm just looking at it from the point of view of Chatto and Roy. They thought of Gandhi as mealy mouthed. So I also, in their, put myself in their shoes and thought of Chatto and, thought of Gandhi and Nehru as making too many compromises and, one step forward, two steps back. Whereas Chatto, right from the beginning, was very uncompromising and he saw uh, that India could never be content with dominion status and the British would, dominion status would be another form of slavery for India. He saw that and he said that right very early on. Okay. That's one thing. His second great achievement was in putting out a lot of propaganda against the British from various countries like Berlin, Stockholm, and all. And a lot of this is lost to us because, the British censored it or it's been lost. And or it's written in other languages because Chatto, I forgot to say that Chatto is an incredible linguist and spoke some 14 languages and could even write in Russian and Swedish and all these things. So he wrote in so many of these papers and he convinced at least a small number of people that India deserved to be independent. And this was not an easy thing to do back then, because back then, India was considered a slave country, okay, even by the most open minded people. And lastly, I think Chatto's achievement was again in the League Against Imperialism, which greatly influenced Nehru and the non aligned movement. And also, Chatto always said that the Congress would become a party of zamindars and businessmen, which would forget about the peasant. And actually, that's what happened because the Indian peasant has been completely forgotten, you know. So that's what happened really. So we can't say that he was did not see the future. Uh, Roy, similar achievements again. Uh, he was uncompromising that India deserves complete independence. And he influenced people in his circles. And then, of course, he had a very he rose to the top ranks of the Comintern until he trespassed. He made that cardinal mistake of saying that India needs to align with the Congress. Then they chucked him out. But until then, he was Lenin's young man. He was sent to China by the Comintern. That ended up in a big mess, not entirely because of his own fault. He founded the Mexican Communist Revolution, which is really strange given that he's not Mexican. you know he had such a prodigious literary output. He wrote over 20 books and he wrote really beautifully for a man who was mostly self-educated, a little full of arrogance and hubris because he was not a modest man, but he wrote beautifully so many books and pamphlets, as did Chatto, but not so many of Chatto's survive. Okay. And Emin Roy eventually he came back, was very instrumental in influencing the early trade unionists because Emin Roy believed in trade unionism. He influenced a lot of the early trade unionists, including, S.A. Dange, V.B. Karnik, Maniben Kara, who was one of the few women trade unionists. and all of whom went on to lead very important institutions in, across India, like, Bombay mill workers and institutions that worked for, trade unions that worked for the worker, for rail workers, for, textile workers, all these early ideas. Because back then, trade unionism was a new thing. The idea of people uniting to work for labor rights was unheard of, you know so he influenced that. He was also instrumental in influencing India's first constitution because he had a draft constitution of his own. And B.R. Ambedkar is supposed to have borrowed from that and borrowed from his ideas. And then, of course, radical humanism, which, as I said, was not very widespread, but did appeal to some people. So he had his own following of radical humanism. It's an attractive philosophy. I just find it impractical. And in all this, I think he greatly influenced India. But the thing is that I feel like they are relevant in 2025 because once again, now we are in a state where any dissension is clamped down upon. I mean, look at that professor in Ashoka who has been arrested for simply saying what he thought of Operation Sindoor. I may not agree with him, but like Voltaire, I defend to the right, defend to the death his right to say it. And now that we are back in a situation where, any dissension is clamped down upon, any, people, who speak against religions are, just quietly disposed of, like, Dabholkar and Kagunde and all those people. So we need people who talk, who have their own ideas. We need dissension. India needs dissension. Okay. It may not need it at all times. Sometimes, yes, when you are going to war the next day, you may not need 100 voices, giving different opinions, but generally you need dissension because otherwise we are just going to fall into this trap of everybody having the same idea, and we can't have that. We need academics, we need historians, we need students, especially because India is such a young country, as you well know, to speak out against so many things. You can't just, arrest people and have them thrown into jail. And then say that, well, they were anti-national, they were seditionists, and you need more. We are now an evolved democracy, and we cannot cling to the uh, things of the past. And for that reason, Roy and Chatto, who actually sacrificed their entire lives to speak out, who could have led quite comfortable lives, especially Chatto. He could have returned to India and led a great life with, his comfortable family home. Or he could have joined Sarojini. He did not. And because of them, people, we need people like them who put everything on the line and spoke out.
Kavitha Rao, thank you so much for frankly speaking about everything and elaborately talking about both the characters, the Chatto and the Roy.
Thank you so much for this podcast. It was great to be able to talk about these fascinating men again. And the book is available in all bookstores and, of course, online on Amazon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Listeners, pick it up.